Let's go. Today I'm talking about the 1978 movie Halloween. As always, this review is going to be spoiler free, so if you like what you see, feel free to subscribe to this channel and like the video. John Carpenter's Halloween is a bona fide horror classic. I'm covering this movie today as the first in a series where I'm going to be reviewing each of the movies in this franchise individually, leading up to the big day itself, Halloween, where I'm going to release a video ranking the entire series from worst to best. As far as the plot of this movie goes, most of us already know it, but I'll go through it for tradition's sake. Halloween follows Laurie Strode, a shy teenager in the fictional town of Haddonfield, who is attacked on Halloween night by a serial killer in a mask named Michael Myers. Now, this movie starts by creating a slasher cliche, and doesn't stop creating them until the very end. The opening scene is of Michael Myers making his first kill, and of course it's infamously shot from the killer's POV. This is a technique that has been used way too many times at this point, but back when this movie was first released, it was a relatively fresh and creative idea, and the movie uses it really well. And this is going to be a reoccurring theme throughout the movie. Watching this movie through modern eyes, it can be hard to see what made it so special back in the day. Much of the genius of this movie comes through subtlety and simplicity, which are things that we're unaccustomed to these days. It's also easy to write off many of the creative and well-executed ideas since we've seen them done so many times since. But in this review, I hope I can shed some light on what makes this movie stand out from the myriad of other slasher movies that have come out since. After the cold open, we get the credits, where we're introduced to John Carpenter's iconic Halloween theme. It's one of the greatest scores in horror movie history, and it's just one of the many things that makes this movie unforgettable. We then start the movie proper by meeting one of the franchise's strangest characters, Dr. Sam Loomis, played by Donald Pleasence. He's been Michael's psychologist for years, and he's deeply convinced that Michael is the shape of pure evil. While this character does get very annoying in future movies, I think he's utilized well here. His main purpose for most of this movie is just to tell us how scary Michael is, since for a long stretch, Michael is just a figure in the periphery who isn't doing any killing. And that's another interesting thing about this movie. It has the lowest body count in the entire franchise. After the opening scene, we go quite a while without witnessing any on-screen deaths. Instead, this movie toys with us. It builds suspense through lingering shots as Michael quietly stalks Laurie throughout the day, so that by the time we finally get to the kills, they are far more impactful. And once we get there, basically all the deaths in this movie are iconic. I'm not much of a gore hound, so I appreciate the approach here, which is pretty toned down compared to most slasher movies nowadays. But despite not having much blood, each death is set up and executed perfectly for maximum impact. Like I said earlier, this movie toys with us. So there are a lot of long, drawn-out scenes where Michael is in the background, and you know that something bad is going to happen, but you don't know when, and that's the fun of it. And then when Michael finally does strike, it's really satisfying. This movie was made on a relatively low budget, which means that they didn't have the money to do anything really extravagant. So instead they had to work with what they had and use simple writing and clever cinematography and lighting to spin a tale of suspense. This is another example of how very often filmmakers who have to work around limitations end up creating something much better than filmmakers who have the world at their fingertips. This movie started the slasher trend that ruled the 80s and 90s, so it very often gets lumped in with slasher films, but this movie actually has more in common with artful suspense pieces like Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho than it does with something like, for instance, a Friday the 13th sequel. Another way that Halloween elevates itself above typical slasher fare is that I actually enjoy following Laurie and her friends. Jamie Lee Curtis does a good job of playing the likable shy girl, and the other youngsters who get picked off throughout the movie are fun to watch and set up well, which is something that many later movies in the genre failed to get right. A lot of these characters do become archetypes for characters in future slasher movies, which might cause some people in my age group who are jaded by movies that have come in the years since to roll their eyes a little bit when they see, for instance, Laurie, the virginal good girl who is afraid of boys and so she gets to live. But for me, I love seeing where the cliches come from, so the movie is interesting on that level. And this movie also just does a lot of this stuff much better than the imitators. However, as good as this movie is, it's not perfect. In my opinion, there are some parts that have not aged very well. There are some stretches of the movie that drag a bit for me, and there are some logistical issues like the famous question, how does Michael know how to drive a car? But my biggest complaint with the movie is actually with the third act. And don't get me wrong, it is a satisfying conclusion to the story, and I do intellectually enjoy the cleverness of it, but it has never been tense or scary to me. In fact, it actually has a weirdly lethargic quality that I feel like no one talks about. I can see how it would have played differently back in the day, but as a modern audience, the suspense in this climax just does not work for me. The last thing I want to talk about is Michael Myers himself. A character so cool he would inspire a remake, 2 reboots, and 8 sequels to date, all exploring him. And while many of those sequels waste the potential of this character, as we will get to very soon, in this original movie, it's easy to see why Michael is such an enduring figure. While many killers in movies are famous for their words, like Chucky or Freddy Krueger, Michael is haunting due to his silence. He never says a single word in this entire movie, and that makes him a mysterious figure who we will never fully understand. We can ask questions about his motives, but the movie never fully answers them. And later sequels will definitely try to explain him, but to very unsatisfying effect. Similarly, his mask, which is his most recognizable trait, is blank, white, and expressionless. The idea that we literally and figuratively can't see the face of the man who is attacking us is so creepy. Michael in this movie feels less like a human who turned bad and more like the boogeyman, the unstoppable embodiment of evil that is coming to get you in your suburban home. In the credits, he's simply credited as the Shape, and I think that's appropriate for what this character is. Halloween is an iconic movie for a reason. Almost everything it does is memorable, and it's not hard to see why it inspired so many imitators and so many sequels. But the real power of this movie is in its simplicity. It's a simple story of an innocent woman running from the faceless embodiment of evil. It almost feels archetypical, and because of that, it continues to haunt us all these years later. This Halloween, I invite modern audiences to go back to where it all started, because this movie does not disappoint. In my opinion, it's a solid 8 out of 10.